The night is dark, but the fire is warm, and there is safety in the light. Welcome back to the campfire, friends. Pull your blankets a little tighter and let the wood smoke settle in your lungs. You found your way to the hearth of Don Quixote, and tonight we're drifting back to a time when the world didn't just lose its way, it lost its very breath. Tonight, we begin the chronicle of Soulblazer. It's a tale of a silent world, a greedy king, and a messenger sent from the heavens to stitch the tapestry of life back together, one soul at a time. It's a story about what we're willing to trade for gold, and what it costs to win back the things that truly matter. The scent of a flower, the bark of a dog, and the warmth of a home. Now, before we descend into the gray mists of Grass Valley, do me a kindness. If you find some peace or a bit of wonder here by the flames, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell. It keeps the fire fed and ensures you won't miss a single chapter as we journey through the realms of the world below. The embers are glowing just right. Lean in close. It's time to talk about the silence and the man who broke it. The Master's realm wasn't some distant gallery of marble and clouds. It was the loom where every heartbeat in the world was first measured and struck. In that high blue stillness, existence didn't pass by the swing of a pendulum or the gears of a clock. It was a constant humming presence, a great river of light that fed every living thing below. The Master sat at the center of that brilliance, not as a tyrant, but as the architect of the balance. He wouldn't reach down to tilt the scales himself, for the world belongs to those who breathe its air and walk its dust. He provides the spark, but the folk below are the ones meant to keep the fire burning. For ages, that fire burned bright enough to blind the stars. But down in the kingdom of Magritte, the shadows began to stretch and thicken. King Magritte was a man possessed by a hunger that no harvest could ever satisfy. He built a castle of such cold, glittering stone that it seemed to mock the sun. Yet he sat on his throne feeling like a beggar. He wasn't looking for more land or more subjects. He was looking for a way to cheat the very nature of loss. He wanted a wealth that didn't rot, and a power that didn't answer to the Master's laws. To find it, he laid his heavy hands on Dr. Leo. Now, Leo was a man whose mind was a cathedral of logic and wonder. He didn't deal in sorcery. He dealt in the fundamental truths of how things are put together. He could make the wind drive engines and make silver sing. Magritte didn't care for the wonder of it, only the utility. He threw Leo into a tower, a jagged spike of stone that pierced the gray clouds, and held the life of Leo's daughter, Lisa, over the man's head like an executioner's axe. Under that pressure, the doctor's brilliance turned into a nightmare. He built a machine that didn't just bridge distances, it tore a hole in the fabric of the world. Through that rift came death toll. He wasn't a god, but a void given form, a merchant from the absolute dark who knew exactly what Magritte's shriveled soul was craving. The bargain was struck in a room that had grown so cold the air felt like glass. For every living soul Magritte surrendered to the abyss, death toll would leave behind a single heavy coin of gold. Magritte looked at his kingdom and saw only a mountain of currency waiting to be minted from the lives of his people. The vanishing started like a slow, creeping frost. At first, it was just the strays, the alley cats and the birds in the rafters. Then, it was the farmers in the distant fields. People would look away for a second, and when they looked back, their neighbor's chair was empty, the tea still steaming on the table. It wasn't a violent end. It was an erasure. The sounds of the world began to thin out. The laughter in the taverns, the clanging of the forges, the crying of newborns. It all just drifted away into the gray silence. Within a few moons, the entire kingdom was a graveyard of standing buildings and empty clothes. The Master looked down from his high seat and saw the tapestry of life falling apart, the vibrant threads being unraveled and pulled into the dark. He couldn't descend to fix the mess man had made, but he could provide a vessel for the light that remained. He called forth a messenger, a spark of the heavens given shape and steel. He didn't arm this messenger with a name, for a name is a heavy thing that ties a man to the earth. He gave the warrior the sword of life, and sent the spirit down into the ash. The fall from the sky palace felt like passing through a dream of fire and ice. When the messenger's boots finally touched the soil of Grass Valley, the world felt fragile, like a piece of parchment that had been left out in the rain too long. Grass Valley had always been a place of vibrant greens and the scent of wild thyme, but now it was wrapped in a suffocating purple haze. The sky was the color of a stale bruise, and the sun was nothing but a pale, sickly memory behind the clouds. The messenger walked through the village, and the sound of a single breath felt like a trespass. The houses stood there, their windows like empty eyes, looking out over streets where nothing moved. There was a blacksmith shop, where a hammer rested on the anvil as if it were waiting for a hand that was never coming back. The air was stagnant, missing the vital movement of birds and insects. It was a world that had been put into a deep, unnatural sleep. The sword of life began to thrum in the messenger's hand, its blue light clarifying the shadows. It pointed the way toward the lairs, those jagged, bleeding wounds in the valley where the dark had taken root. These weren't just pits. They were prisons where the essence of the world was being held captive. The first one approached was a jagged tear in the hillside, breathing out a mist that smelled of rotten old iron. The creatures that guarded the entrance were the cherry spirits, twisted, wooden mockeries of life that looked as though they'd been carved by a madman. They moved with a dry, splintering sound, their limbs jerking in patterns that defied the natural order. They didn't have eyes, yet their malice focused on the intruder, a hatred for the light that had arrived. The messenger stepped into the gloom, and the fight wasn't just a matter of steel against wood. It was a reclamation of the world's spirit. Every time that blade sliced through corrupted timber, a small pocket of the silence was broken. The deeper the messenger pushed into the dens, the more the reality of the valley began to distort. There were rooms where the walls seemed to be made of frozen screams, and the ground was slick with a liquid that wasn't quite water and wasn't quite blood. Then came the metal scorpions, those cold, clanking sentinels that were the perversion of Leo's genius. They didn't fight with passion. They fought with a mechanical indifference. Their stingers lashed out with the speed of a striking snake, seeking to drain the very warmth from a living soul. The messenger waded through them, carving arcs of brilliant blue through the dark. This was no mere soldier. This was a weaver, catching the frayed ends of the world and tying them back together. At the center of the lair, where the dark was so thick it felt like physical weight, stood the guardian, a hulking mass of shadow and jagged edges that seemed to drink the light from the room. The struggle was brief but desperate. The beast moved with a frantic, stuttering energy, its claws ripping through the air like a winter wind. The messenger waited for the moment the creature overextended, then drove the sword of life deep into its core. The light didn't just kill the creature, it erased it. A wave of pure white heat washed outward, scouring the walls and dissolving the shadows, until the lair was nothing but a hollow cave of stone once more. From the heart of that dying dark, a single spark of light emerged. It was small, no larger than a firefly, but it burned with a fierce, stubborn intensity. It shot upward, returning to the world above. The messenger followed it out of the den, emerging back into the quiet of the village. The spark dived into a patch of dry, gray earth near the entrance of the valley. The messenger stood there, leaning on the hilt of the sword, watching the dirt begin to heave. It wasn't a fast growth, but a steady, inexorable push. A green stem, vibrant and full of sap, rose from the ash, followed by a bud that looked like a drop of crimson ink against the purple sky. Slowly the petals began to unfurl, reaching out to touch the air. It was a tulip. It stood there, solitary and bright, the only real color in 1,000 yards. But as those petals opened, A ripple went through the world. A breeze, a genuine living wind, caught the scent of that flower and carried it across the valley. Where the scent touched the trees, the stone-like bark began to soften. Where it drifted through the empty houses, the air lost its stale, dusty weight. The silence of the world didn't vanish, but it shifted. It became the silence of a house at dawn, waiting for the sun to rise, rather than the silence of the grave. The soul of the tulip spoke then, a faint echo in the messenger's mind. It didn't offer grand prophecies. It offered a simple, aching memory of the gardener who used to tend this soil. It spoke of the others, of the humans trapped in deeper, darker pits, and of the animals whose spirits were being used as fuel for Death Toll's machinery. The first stitch had been made, but the tapestry was vast, and the dark was already starting to gather its strength for a counterstrike. The messenger looked at that flower, swaying in the wind, and realized the magnitude of the task. This wasn't just about saving people. It was about saving the memory of how to live. Each soul returned was a blow against the bargain Magritte had made. The tulip was the proof that the abyss couldn't hold on to what it didn't understand. The sword of life grew warm, a signal that the next lair was calling. The sky was still dark, and the road ahead led into the jagged peaks of the mountains, where the cold would be the greatest enemy. The messenger turned away from the red flower, finding the path that led toward the higher ground. The restoration had begun, and there would be no stopping until the last chair was filled and the last song was sung. The walk up the mountain was steep, the air growing thin and sharp as a blade. But with every step, the messenger carried the scent of that tulip, a reminder that even in the heart of the void, life is a stubborn thing that refuses to stay buried. The shadows of Greenwood were waiting ahead, thick with the spirits of the forest, but the light was coming for them. And this time, it wouldn't be denied. The path wound higher, through passes where the wind howled like a wounded animal. The messenger didn't slow, didn't look back. There were more holes to close, more souls to pull from the teeth of the dark. Each step was a defiance of the king's greed and the demon's hunger. The silence of the valley was fading, replaced by the steady rhythm of boots on stone and the hum of a blade that knew its purpose. The world was waking up, and it was starting with the mountains. The air in the mountain pass didn't just grow cold, it grew thin, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of the void that still clung to the rocks like a frost that wouldn't melt. The messenger climbed, the sword of life acting as a steady blue lantern against the purple gloom of the peaks. Every step away from the village was a step deeper into the memory of what had been lost. Behind, a single tulip stood as a beacon of red defiance, but ahead lay the great forest of Greenwood. In the days before the silence, Greenwood was a place where the canopy was so thick the sun only reached the floor in dappled golden coins. It was a kingdom of bark and leaf, governed by the ancient laws of the wood and the animals who called it home. But as the messenger crested the final ridge, the forest that greeted those boots wasn't green. It was a skeletal waste. The massive oaks and towering pines stood like bleached bones, their branches stripped of leaf and life, reaching up toward the bruised sky like the fingers of drowning men. The silence here was heavier than it had been in the valley. In Grass Valley, the quiet felt like a pause, but in Greenwood, it felt like a sentence. There were no crickets chirping in the tall grass, no owls calling from the hollows. Just the dry, hollow rattle of wood scraping against wood as a dead breeze moved through the timber. The messenger stood at the edge of that timber, feeling the weight of 1,000 years of growth turned into a graveyard. It's one thing to see a house empty of people, but it's another thing entirely to see a forest empty of life. A forest without a pulse is just a collection of dying sticks, and the messenger could feel the ache of the soil underneath, begging for a reason to push up a sprout. The messenger found the first of the forest layers near the roots of an ancient gnarled stump that looked like a throne for a king of ghosts. The darkness here didn't just sit in a hole. It pulsed. It felt older, more rooted in the earth, like a cancer that had wrapped its roots around the very heart of the world. As the warrior descended into the fur's den, the smell of damp earth was replaced by the stench of stagnant water and old, wet fur. The monsters here were different too. They were the mud dolls. Squat, heavy things made of the very mire of the forest floor. Infused with the spite of death toll's reach, they didn't move like living things. They lumbered with a wet, sucking sound, their forms shifting and melting back into the floor when the sword of life got too close. The messenger had to time every strike, waiting for the moment the mud hardened into a shape that could be cut. Each time the steel bit home, a fragment of the forest soul would tear free, spiraling upward like a spark from a fire. One by one, the animals began to return to the world above. First, it was the squirrels, their sudden frantic movements breaking the stillness of the trees. Then came the deer, standing like statues in the clearings, their large, dark eyes reflecting the messenger's light with a mixture of fear and profound confusion. But the heart of Greenwood's tragedy lay deeper, in the soul of a creature named Turbo. Now, Turbo had been a dog, but calling him just a dog is like calling the sun just a light. He was the guardian of the wood and a loyal companion to the folk who lived on its edges. When the vanishing came, Turbo didn't just disappear. He fought. He'd sensed the dark coming long before the humans did. Dogs always do. And he'd spent his last breaths trying to drive it back from the threshold of his master's home. The messenger found Turbo's soul trapped in a den of ice and shadow, guarded by a beast that looked like a wolf made of obsidian and glass. The battle in that frozen hollow was a dance of heat against frost. The messenger's blade struck sparks from the obsidian hide of the beast, the friction sending plumes of steam into the frozen air. The wolf thing howled, and the sound was like ice cracking on a deep lake. It moved with a speed that defied the cramped space, leaping from the shadows and vanishing before the sword could find its mark. The messenger had to stop relying on eyes and start relying on the thrum of the sword of life. When the final blow fell and the shadow wolf shattered, Turbo's soul didn't just fly away. It lingered. It circled the messenger, a warm, golden glow that smelled of wood smoke and wet fur. As Turbo returned to the world, the forest itself began to shiver. A wave of green, so bright it almost hurt to look at, raced across the canopy. Leaves unfurled in a frantic rush, filling the air with the scent of pine and crushed fern. The animals found their voices again, a chorus of chirps, howls, and songs that drowned out the rattle of the dead wood. But Turbo remained a ghost, a guardian of the spirit world who couldn't fully cross back. He became the messenger's guide, a silent reminder that some things, once broken, can only be mended in spirit. He'd trot ahead into the shadows, his translucent tail wagging as he pointed the way toward the next wound in the forest. With the forest breathing again, the path led downward, away from the roots and toward the salt spray of the coast. The transition was jarring. One moment the messenger was surrounded by the press of the timber, and the next, the world opened up into the vast, lonely expanse of the ocean. This was St. El's, the sunken kingdom. Before Magritte made his bargain, St. El's was a wonder of coral and light, where the mermaids lived in harmony with the tides. But now, the ocean was a gray, heaven desert. The waves didn't crash. They slumped against the shore like they were tired of existing. The messenger waded into the surf, the master's light providing a bubble of air and clarity as the water closed overhead. The pressure down there was immense, a physical weight that tried to squeeze the light right out of the sword. It was a world of muffled thuds and long, slow shadows. The world beneath the waves was a graveyard of sunken ships and shattered reefs. The sunlight didn't reach down here anymore, blocked by a layer of oily shadow that sat on the surface of the sea like a shroud. The monsters in the deep were nightmares of scale and tooth, the water walkers and the soul eaters that drifted through the kelp forests like ghosts looking for a home. They'd emerge from the murk, their eyes glowing with a pale, cold light, and the messenger would have to fight against the resistance of the water, swinging the blade in slow, heavy arcs that felt like moving through wet cement. The messenger moved through the ruins of the mermaid palaces, the sword of life cast in long, distorted shadows against the coral walls. The silence here was different. It was thick, pressing against the ears with the weight of 1,000 fathoms. In one of the great halls, the warrior found the soul of the mermaid queen, trapped in a cage of jagged obsidian. She wasn't screaming, she was waiting, her eyes full of a weary, eternal patience that only those who live beneath the tides can truly understand. Freeing her required descending into the deepest trenches, where the heat of the earth's core met the chill of the abyss. The messenger fought through swarms of glowing, jelly-like horrors that pulsed with a sick, rhythmic light, their stingers trailing behind him like poison ribbons. Each strike of the sword was a struggle against the weight of the water itself. But as the queen's soul was liberated, the ocean began to wake. The gray, stagnant water started to churn, clearing away the oil and letting the first rays of the master's light pierce the depths in long, shimmering fingers. The coral, once bleached and brittle, bloomed in a riot of pinks, oranges, and blues. The mermaids returned, drifting through the water like shards of silver, their voices rising in a song that could be heard even on the surface. It was a song about the moon and the tides, a melody that had been silenced since the day the king reached for the gold. But the queen, like Turbo, carried a burden that couldn't be washed away by the tide. She spoke to the messenger of the flow of time, of how the sea remembers everything and forgets nothing. She spoke of Dr. Leo, who had once looked out over these waters and dreamed of a way to bridge the gap between the land and the sea. He'd visited her in the dreams of the ocean, seeking a way to protect his daughter from the growing darkness in the king's heart. She revealed that one of the fragments of the master's emblem, the artifacts needed to challenge death toll, was hidden in the depths of a volcano that rose from the seafloor like a burning tooth. The messenger journeyed into the heart of that fire, where the rock was molten and the air was thick with sulfur. It was a place where the ocean met its ancient enemy. There, amidst the roar of the magma and the hiss of the steam, the warrior faced the guardian of the flame. It was a battle of endurance, of holding on to the light while the world tried to burn it away. The guardian was a beast of smoke and ember, its every movement kicking up clouds of ash that blinded the eyes. But the messenger didn't need eyes. The sword of life sang when the enemy was near. When the guardian fell, the messenger claimed the first piece of the emblem, a fragment of stone that felt as heavy as a mountain and as hot as a sun. Emerging from the ocean, the messenger stood on the black sands of the shore, the sword of life dripping with salt water and light. 2 realms had been restored, but the cost was etched into the warrior's spirit. The forest was green, and the sea was blue, but the silence was only finding new places to hide. The king's greed had reached deep into the earth and far under the waves, and the threads of the tapestry were still frayed and bleeding. The messenger looked at the reflection in the wet sand. A warrior with no name, carrying a sword that was getting heavier with every soul freed. There's a certain kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from the muscles, but from the soul. The messenger felt it then, the realization that for every flower that bloomed and every mermaid that sang, there was still a world of ghosts waiting for their turn. The guilt of Magritte wasn't just a crime. It was a weight that the messenger had to carry, step by agonizing step. The messenger looked back toward the mountains. The next trial wouldn't be found in the trees or the tides. It would be found in the high, frozen wastes of the Mountain of Souls, where the air was too cold for breath and the shadows were made of ice. It was a place where life didn't just struggle. It froze solid. The journey was only half over, and the weight of the restored world was starting to press down on the warrior's shoulders like a physical burden. But the scent of the tulip was still there, faint beneath the smell of pine and salt. And the memory of Turbo's loyalty and the Queen's patience provided a rhythm for the march ahead. The messenger adjusted the grip on the sword of life, the blade thrumming with a renewed purpose, and started the long climb toward the peaks. The dark was growing desperate, seeing its prizes snatched back one by one, and it was starting to concentrate its hate. Death Toll, watching from his throne of gold and ghosts, was starting to feel the first cold touch of fear. He'd bet on a king's greed, but he hadn't accounted for the stubbornness of a messenger who didn't know how to quit. The road to the summit was long, and the winds were gathering for a storm, but the morning was inevitable. Each step was a heartbeat. Each breath was a defiance. The messenger moved forward, a lone spark in a world that was slowly, achingly, learning how to dream again. The shadows of the mountain were deep, but the fire in the messenger's spirit was deeper. And in the silence of the snow, the story was just beginning its most difficult chapter. The ascent up the Mountain of Souls wasn't just a climb. It was an act of grim endurance against a world that had forgotten how to feel the touch of warmth. The messenger's boots crunched through a crust of ice that had formed over the memories of an entire civilization, a frozen layer of history that cracked like bone under every step. Up here, the air was a different kind of enemy. It was thin, sharp as a whetted blade, and it tasted of ancient stone and stagnant frost. The sky wasn't just purple anymore. It was a deep, bruised indigo that seemed to press down on the peaks, trying to flatten the world into a permanent, suffocating sleep. Every breath the messenger took felt like swallowing needles, the cold reaching deep into the lungs to find any remaining spark of the master's fire to snuff out. The silence of the mountain was unlike the rustle of the forest or the slump of the sea. It was a ringing silence, the kind that makes your own heartbeat sound like a hammer striking a drum in an empty marble cathedral. There were no trees to rattle, no waves to slump against the shore, just the hollow, mournful howl of a wind that didn't carry the scent of anything living. The messenger paused at a jagged overlook, looking back at the world below. From this height, Greenwood looked like a tiny, insignificant patch of moss, and St. El's was just a silver shimmer on a dead horizon. The restoration felt small from up here. It felt like trying to light a single candle in the teeth of a cosmic blizzard. The doubt started to creep in, cold as the ice on the rocks, whispering that the king's bargain was too deep and the abyss was too wide to ever truly bridge. But the sword of life wouldn't let the messenger linger on those dark thoughts. It thrummed against the palm with a steady, rhythmic heat, a reminder that the master's light doesn't care about the size of the dark. It only cares about piercing it. The first of the mountain layers was carved into the side of a glacier, a jagged blue maw that looked like the throat of an ancient winter god waiting to swallow the sun. Inside, the walls were sheets of translucent ice, and trapped within them were the shapes of the mountain folk, gnomes and climbers frozen mid-stride, their faces locked in expressions of eternal surprise. They looked like statues in a museum of the damned, their spirits visible as faint, flickering embers beneath the frozen surface. The monsters here were the ice puppets and the blizzard mages, creatures that didn't just fight. They tried to steal the heat right out of the messenger's blood. They moved with a brittle, crackling grace, flinging shards of frost that felt like needles of white fire when they hit. The messenger had to move constantly, keeping the spirit burning, just to prevent the leather of the boots from freezing to the floor. Every swing of the sword sent a spray of diamond-sharp ice flying, and every layer cleared sent a shockwave of warmth through the glacier. You could hear the mountain groaning as the ice began to shift, the stone complaining as the grip of the void was slowly pried loose. When the first of the gnomes was finally freed, he didn't just wake up, he thawed. He shook the frost from his beard and told the messenger of the great painting, a masterpiece created by Dr. Leo in his madness, a work of art that had become a prison of a different sort. But before the messenger could reach that canvas, the mountain had one last trial to demand. At the very summit, where the wind was strong enough to scour the skin from the bone, and the light of the master was a mere pinprick in the indigo sky, the warrior faced the guardian of the peaks. It was a massive flying terror of scale and frost, a creature that lived in the eye of the storm and fed on the isolation of the heights. The battle at the summit was a blur of blind and white and piercing blue. The messenger had to plant every step with a prayer, fearing the gale would toss a mortal frame into the bottomless abyss below. The beast circled, its wings striking the air with the sound of shattering glass before it dived with its talons outstretched. The messenger took the hit, the cold of the creature's touch turning the armor to ice, but as it passed, the sword of life found its mark. When the beast finally fell, its body dissolving into a frantic flurry of snow, the mountain began to exhale. It wasn't a quick melt, but a softening. A low, subterranean moan echoed through the rock as the frozen rivers started to move again, breaking their chains with the sound of thunder. The gnomes returned to their fires, and the mountain began to breathe a cold, clean air that didn't taste of the void anymore. But the path didn't lead back down to the valley. It led into the secret laboratory of Dr. Leo, a place of brass pipes, silent gears, and the smell of oil and old parchment. In the center of the room, bathed in a shaft of pale light, stood the easel. It held the work that had cost the doctor his soul and his peace. It was a painting of a city, a place of impossible beauty and light. But now it was a trap for the spirits of those who had sought refuge in art when the real world turned to ash. The messenger looked at the canvas and felt a pull that wasn't physical. It was a call to the imagination, a lure into a world where the rules of the master didn't apply. The messenger touched the canvas, and the world didn't just change. It dissolved. Suddenly, the warrior was walking through a landscape of oil and pigment. The sky was a swirl of thick, aggressive brushstrokes, and the buildings were made of colors that didn't exist in the real world. Shades of sunset and shadow that felt like they were bleeding off the walls. This was Leo's painting, a surrealist nightmare where logic was merely a suggestion, and the dark had taken a more subtle, tempting form. The monsters here weren't made of mud or ice. They were the sketched horrors, two-dimensional shadows that could slip under a door like a letter or hide in a splash of crimson paint. They didn't make a sound when they moved. They just blurred the edges of the world until you couldn't tell what was real and what was just a mark on the page. Walking through the painting felt like moving through a fever dream that refused to break. The messenger would turn a corner and find a street that led directly into the sky, or a house that was bigger on the inside than the outside, its hallways winding into loops of impossible geometry. The silence here was different. It was a muffled, suffocating quiet, like someone had wrapped the whole world in thick, heavy felt. The messenger found the souls of the artists and the models, people who had been so obsessed with the beauty of the painting that they hadn't noticed when the frame became a cage. They were wandering the painted streets, their eyes vacant, looking for a sun that never moved and a wind that never blew. In the heart of the canvas, where the colors were the most vibrant and the shadows the most deep, the messenger found the model of Lisa, a living memory of the doctor's daughter, created by a man who couldn't bear the thought of losing her to the king's greed. She was the anchor for the entire realm, a spark of pure, desperate love that death toll had twisted into a lock for the world's spirit. To free her, the messenger had to face the guardian of the canvas, a creature made of every discarded thought, every smudged line, and every failed sketch Leo had ever produced in his long, lonely career. It was a shifting, nameless mass of ink and spite that changed its shape with every breath the messenger took. The fight inside the painting was a test of the spirit more than the blade. The messenger had to realize that in a world made of imagination, the sword of life wasn't just a weapon, it was a brush of light. By focusing the master's intent, the warrior painted a path of clarity through the swirling ink, striking at the core of the shadow until the canvas itself began to ripple and tear. Every blow sent droplets of color flying like sparks, and as the guardian began to unravel, the painted world started to lose its grip. When the beast was finally undone, the painting didn't just disappear. It returned to being just a painting. The souls trapped inside were cast back into the world of flesh and bone, waking up in Leo's lab with the taste of linseed oil on their tongues and the haunting memory of a colorful prison fading from their minds. The messenger stood back in the laboratory, the sword of life fading to a soft, weary glow. The mountain was awake. The fires of the gnomes were burning once more, and the painting on the easel was just a beautiful silent picture. 3 realms were restored, and the messenger could feel the weight of them all pressing against the spirit. The forest's wild life, the sea's eternal song, and the mountain's unyielding fire. They were all gathered in the warrior's chest, a burning constellation of stolen souls waiting to be set free for good. But there was no time to celebrate, and the air held no room for rest. The model of Lisa had whispered a name before she vanished back into the mists of memory. Magrid Castle. The source of the rot. The place where the gold was minted, and the souls were sold like cattle. The messenger looked out the high window of the laboratory, seeing the dark, jagged spires of the castle rising in the distance like the teeth of a trap set for the world. It sat there on the horizon, a monument to one man's ego and the abyss's hunger, surrounded by a sky that was starting to flicker with the first frantic lightning of a gathering storm. The air in the lab was warm now, heated by the return of the sun and the breath of the living. But the messenger felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather or the altitude. The next realm wasn't a place of nature's beauty or art's wonder. It was a place of cold iron, naked greed, and the final, desperate gambit of a dying king. The threads of the tapestry were coming together, and the pattern was starting to reveal the terrible face of the enemy. The messenger checked the hilt of the sword, feeling every nick and scar on the blade from the ice of the peaks and the ink of the canvas. You don't bring back a world without taking a bit of its pain into your own soul. And the messenger was starting to look as weary as the world felt. The warrior turned toward the door, the scent of the tulip still a faint, ghostly reminder of why the march began in the first place. The road to the castle was paved with the broken dreams of a kingdom that had traded its future for a pile of yellow metal. And the messenger was ready to walk every agonizing inch of it. The morning was closer than it had ever been, but the darkest part of the night was waiting behind those iron gates. Death Toll's gold was turning to lead in the king's vaults, and the master's messenger was coming to collect the debt in full. With a steady hand and a heart heavy with the weight of 3 worlds, the warrior stepped out into the light, ready for the penultimate chapter of the silence. The storm was waiting, and so was the king. The air around Magrid Castle didn't just smell of sulfur and the approaching storm. It smelled of the bitter, metallic sweat of a kingdom that had worked itself to death for a handful of cold, yellow gold. As the messenger approached the high, jagged walls, the sky finally broke. A flash of lightning, white and jagged as a broken bone, illuminated the spires, showing a style of architecture that was less about beauty and more about the raw, naked intimidation of a tyrant. This was the seat of the king who had broken the world. It was a monument to the fear of loss, built from the very souls he'd sold to the abyss in a fit of desperate, shriveled greed. The stone of the walls looked wet, even before the rain hit, as if the castle itself was leaking the tears of the thousands who had vanished within its shadow. The silence here was different from the piercing ringing of the mountain or the muffled weight of the sea. It was a heavy, industrial silence, the sound of massive gears that had stopped turning mid-rotation and great fires that had gone cold, leaving behind only the smell of ash and oil. In the courtyard, the messenger found the statues of the royal guard, men who had stood watch over a kingdom of ghosts until the void finally reached for them too. They stood in rigid, frozen lines, their stone eyes staring at the gates they could no longer protect. The messenger's boots rang out on the cobblestones, a lonely, defiant sound that seemed to echo through the empty halls and up into the rafters where the shadows were waiting, thick and hungry. Every step was a challenge to the king's pride, a reminder that the master's light was finally coming for the heart of the rot. Inside the castle, the laboratory of Dr. Leo stretched out like a museum of madness and regret. There were blueprints for machines that could bridge the gap between worlds, and half-finished inventions that looked more like instruments of torture than tools of progress. The floor was littered with discarded sketches and brass violins, the debris of a genius who had been forced to use his mind as a weapon against his own kind. The messenger found the spirit of the real Lisa here, not the painted model from the canvas, but the flesh-and-blood daughter who had watched her father unravel under the king's suffocating pressure. She was a flicker of hope in a place of absolute shadow, her eyes carrying the weight of a grief that no sword could ever fully cut away. She spoke of the king's final gambit, a machine called the airship, a vessel of iron and silk that could carry the master's enemies into the very heavens, turning the sky palace itself into a battlefield. To reach the king, the messenger had to wade through the layers of the castle, places where the dark was so thick it felt like moving through liquid lead. The monsters here were the chess knights and the iron soldiers, mockeries of the king's own army, moved by the cold, mechanical spite of Death Toll's reach. They didn't feel pain, and they didn't know the meaning of fear. They just kept coming, their metal armor screeching against the stone floor as the sword of life carving through their ranks in arcs of brilliant blue fire. Each strike of the blade sent showers of sparks into the gloom, lighting up the faces of the stone statues that seemed to be watching the slaughter with empty, envious eyes, as if they were jealous of the monsters for having a form to lose. The deeper the messenger went, the more the castle began to feel like a living thing, a beast of iron and stone that was trying to digest the very light of the heavens. You could hear the gears of the world grinding in the walls. The sound of Magride's greed still echoes in the steam pipes that hissed like dying snakes. The messenger found the souls of the servants, the scholars, and the cooks, people who had spent their lives serving a man who didn't even remember their names once the gold started flowing into his vaults. They were huddled in the corners of the dark, their spirits looking thin and frayed, like old cloth that had been washed too many times until the color had bled out. They whispered of the great engine, the pulsating heart of the castle's power that was keeping the dark anchored to the earth. Freeing them required breaking the locks on that engine, a task that sent the messenger descending into the boiler rooms, where the heat was so intense it felt like the very air was trying to ignite in the lungs. The walls here were coated in a thick layer of soot, and the floor vibrated with a low, thrumming malice. The guardian here was a mass of piston, valve, and steam, a clockwork horror that moved with a relentless, jerky precision that defied the natural rhythm of life. It swung massive iron arms that could crush a man into a red smear, each movement accompanied by a blast of scalding air. The battle was a test of timing and raw nerve, with the messenger dodging between the steam vents and the crushing weight of the gears. When the final gear was shattered and the engine sputtered to its death, the castle shuddered. A long, low groan vibrated through the floorboards, and the lights in the heavy chandeliers flickered out, replaced by the soft blue glow of the souls returning to their bodies in the rooms above. But the king was still waiting in the high tower, his gold piled around him like a wall against the truth. The messenger climbed the spiral stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The weight of the restored realms, the forest, the sea, the mountain, and now the castle, was pressing down on the warrior's spirit like a physical burden. You don't save a world without feeling the cost of every life you've pulled back from the brink of the abyss. By the time the messenger reached the heavy, iron-bound doors of the throne room, the sword of life was thrumming so hard, it felt like the steel might shatter from the pressure of the souls it carried. King Magride sat on his throne, but he didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a corpse that had forgotten to fall over and rot. His skin was the color of old parchment. His eyes were milky with the fog of the void, and his hands were curled into rigid claws, clutching a single gold coin that glittered with a sick, oily light. He didn't see the messenger enter. He only saw the gold. He spoke in a voice that sounded like gravel in a tin can, ranting about his bargain and the wealth that would live forever. Even as his kingdom crumbled around him, he had traded the breath of his people for a pile of yellow metal, and in the end, The metal was the only thing he had left to talk to. "You've come for the debt," the king wheezed, his gaze finally fixing on the piercing blue light of the sword. "But Death Toll doesn't give refunds. He only takes. He took my kingdom, and now he'll take the master's toy." The king didn't fight with a sword or a shield. He fought with the very gold he'd hoarded, until it became his god. The coins rose from the floor in a swirling, screaming vortex of greed, forming a shield around the throne that the sword of life couldn't pierce through force alone. The messenger had to realize that you can't fight greed with strength. You have to fight it with the memory of what the gold was meant to buy. By calling on the spirits of the restored realms, the scent of the first tulip, the song of the mermaid queen, the warmth of the gnome's hearth, the messenger broke the king's concentration. The gold fell to the floor with a hollow, useless clatter, sounding like pebbles in a dry well, and the king's shadow was finally cast out of the throne room. But Magritte didn't find peace in his defeat. As his soul was liberated from the dark, the veil lifted, and he realized the absolute horror of what he'd done. He saw the empty chairs at the banquet tables, the silent forges in the square, and the daughter he'd forgotten in his quest for more. His scream echoed through the stone halls of the castle, a sound of such pure, unadulterated regret that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. He vanished into a flash of white light, leaving behind only the gold that had been his undoing, now just cold metal on a dirty floor. The messenger stood alone in the throne room as the storm outside reached its peak, lightning striking the spires in a rhythmic, angry pulse. The castle was waking up, the souls were returning to the stone, and the king was gone. But the work wasn't finished. The airship was waiting on the roof, fueled by the last of Leo's genius and the master's grim resolve. The source of the rot had been cleared, but the architect of the abyss was still waiting in the world of evil. Death Toll hadn't been defeated. He'd just been provoked into showing his true face. The messenger looked at the sword of life, seeing the reflection of a warrior who had grown weary of the blood, the ash, and the weight of other people's sins. The journey from the Sky Palace had been a long one, and the cost was written in every line of the warrior's spirit. But the morning was calling. The clouds were starting to break over the castle, showing a hint of the blue that used to rule the sky before the bargain was made. The messenger walked toward the roof, the scent of the tulips still a faint, ghostly reminder of why the first step was taken in the valley. The airship was a wonder of brass, wood, and silk, its engines humming with a vibration that felt like a heartbeat returning to a dead body. Lisa was there, standing by the rail, looking out over the kingdom her father had helped destroy and the world the messenger had helped save. She didn't say a word, but her presence was a promise that the world could be built again, better and stronger than before. The messenger stepped onto the deck, the sword of life glowing with a fierce final intensity that rivaled the lightning. The path to the world of evil was open, a jagged rift in the sky waiting for the final confrontation. Death Toll was waiting in the dark, his gold turning to dust as the master's light approached his doorstep. The messenger checked the hilt of the sword, feeling the weight of the 5 realms, the forest, the sea, the mountain, and the castle, resting in the palm of the hand. The threads were all here, frayed and bleeding, but they were finally held in a single, purposeful grip. With a steady breath and a gaze fixed on the abyss ahead, the messenger gave the command to launch. The airship rose into the stormy sky, leaving the stone and the gold behind. The penultimate stitch had been made, and the final duel was all that remained between the world and the dawn. The morning was closer than it had ever been, and the master's messenger was coming to finish the song, once and for all. The airship didn't sail through the clouds so much as it cut through the very fabric of reality itself, leaving the stone spires of Magritte's pride in the breaking storm far below. The sky around the vessel was a churning vortex of violet black and a sick, oily green, the jagged edges of the world of evil ripping open to receive the master's messenger like a wound in the heavens. On the deck, the wind howled with a sound that wasn't just weather. It was the collective memory of 1,000 voices pleading for a mercy they never received. The messenger stood firm at the prow, the sword of life burning with a steady, unyielding blue flame that cast long, flickering shadows against the brass railings. Lisa stood just behind, her eyes reflecting the flicker of the abyss ahead, a silent witness to the end of her father's nightmare and the birth of a new, uncertain dawn. This wasn't a journey of miles anymore. It was a journey of finality, a move toward the place where the shadows are made. The transition was a violent shock to the senses, a feeling like falling up and down at the same time. One moment, Magritte Castle was a dark, jagged shape in the rain, and the next, the airship was drifting through a void where the stars didn't shine. They bled. This was Death Toll's domain, a realm built entirely out of the hollow spaces left behind when hope is extinguished and greed takes root. There were no trees here to rustle, no mountains to climb, and no oceans to slump against a shore. Just a vast, glittering wasteland of the gold that had cost the world its soul. The ground beneath the airship's shadow wasn't dirt or stone. It was paved with an endless, rolling sea of the very coins Magritte had traded his people for. Every time the wind blew, the coins shifted and hissed like 1,000,000 dying snakes, a metallic rustle that sounded like the clinking of chains in a deep, dark well. The messenger stepped off the deck and onto the cold, metallic soil of the abyss. The weight of the 5 realms, the memory of the first tulip scent, the unswerving loyalty of Turbo, the weary patience of the Mermaid Queen, the stubborn warmth of the gnome's fires, and even the tragic regret of the king, was a heavy, thrumming presence in the warrior's chest. Every soul that had been pulled back from the dark was now a part of the blade, lending its individual spark to the master's fire. The sword of life didn't just glow. It roared with a high, clear note that pierced through the oily mists of the world of evil like a lighthouse piercing a storm of pure ink. Each step the messenger took across that sea of gold made a hollow mockery of a sound, a reminder of the price that had been paid for this wasteland to exist. At the center of this glittering desert sat the throne of Death Toll. It wasn't made of marble or gold, but of the very absence of life, a structure of shadows that seemed to drink the light from the air. Death Toll himself was a nightmare-given physical form, a hulking, multi-armed terror with eyes that looked like dying suns fading into a black hole. He didn't speak with words that the ears could catch. He spoke with a psychic weight that tried to crush the messenger's spirit into the metallic dust. He was the embodiment of the void, the ultimate merchant who had convinced a dying king that a pile of yellow metal was worth more than the breath of his daughter or the song of the sea. He looked at the messenger and didn't see a hero. He saw a thief coming to reclaim a collection he'd spent eons gathering. The final duel began not with a clash of steel, but with a collision of pure will. Death Toll unleashed the full degrading power of the abyss, summoning shadows that took the haunting forms of every monster the messenger had faced on the long road from Grass Valley. The cherry spirits rose from the gold, their wooden limbs snapping like dry bone. The metal scorpions clanked through the coins, their stingers dripping with the frost of the Mountain of Souls. They all swarmed out of the dark, a frantic, screaming wave of hate. But the messenger didn't flinch. With a single sweeping arc of the sword of life that lit up the entire wasteland, the warrior called upon the phoenix, the ultimate manifestation of the master's restoring fire. The bird of flame erupted from the blade with a screech that shattered the silence of the void, its wings catching the darkness and turning it to ash in a blinding display of heat, light, and absolute purpose. Death Toll roared, a sound that shook the foundations of the void and made the very gold coins beneath him fly into the air like shrapnel. He lunged, his many arms striking with the speed of a striking snake and the force of a fallen mountain. But the messenger moved with the grace of the wind and the certainty of the dawn. This was the final dance of the restoration, a fight for every blade of grass, every mermaid's song, and every heartbeat that had been stolen. The warrior drove the sword of life deep into the Shiftian heart of the demon, and for a second that seemed to last an eternity, the entire world of evil went silent. The gold coins on the ground shattered into worthless dust, and the sky above began to crack like a broken mirror, revealing the true piercing blue of the Master's realm bleeding through the dark. Death Toll didn't just die. He unraveled like a piece of old, rotten cloth. The darkness that had held the world captive for so long was sucked back into the rift, disappearing into the nothingness from which it had been summoned. The messenger stood in the center of the vanishing realm, the sword of life fading to a soft, weary shimmer as the weight of the task finally began to lift. The debt was paid. The contract was shredded. The world below was free to breathe again, and the silence was finally, truly broken. But as the light of the morning began to break over the horizon of the real world, the Master's voice echoed through the chambers of the messenger's spirit. The job was done, and the warrior was called to return to the Sky Palace, to leave the dirt, the sweat, and the breath behind, and return to the stagnant, perfect peace of the heavens. The Master spoke of a reward beyond measure, a place where the pain of the world could never reach. The warrior looked at the sword, then looked down at the world that was waking up below, a world where the birds were starting to sing in the greenwood and the smoke was finally rising from the chimneys of Magrid Castle. It was a world of flaws, of hunger, and of endings. But it was a world that was alive. The messenger made a choice that hadn't been written in the Master's divine blueprints. Instead of ascending back into the light, the warrior laid the sword of life down in the grass of the valley, surrendering the divinity, the immortality, and the glow for a chance to walk the soil as a simple, mortal man. The memory of the heavens faded like a dream at sunrise, replaced by the sharp scent of the tulip and the rough feel of the wind on the skin. To live is to lose, and to live is to die. But the messenger realized that a life without the possibility of loss is no life at all. The divinity was a cage of its own, and the warrior chose the freedom of the dirt. A stranger walked into Grass Valley that morning, a man with no name, no title, and a quiet, weary smile that spoke of 1,000 miles traveled in the dark. He passed the old well, where the water was flowing clear and cool once more, and walked past the blacksmith's forge, where the hammer was finally ringing against the anvil in a rhythm of honest work. He found his way to a house on the edge of the village, where a girl named Lisa was tending to a garden of red flowers that looked like drops of blood against the green. She looked up as the gate creaked, and though she didn't recognize his face, she recognized the light in his eyes, a light that had traveled through the deepest night to bring the morning home. She didn't ask who he was or where he'd come from. She just held out a hand, and the man took it. The silence was finally over, and the song of the world was just beginning its next beautiful verse. The threads were woven, the tapestry was whole, and for the first time in a long age, the sun rose over a world that knew exactly what it was worth. The embers are fading now, glowing low like the eyes of a tired traveler. But the warmth, well, that's going to stay with you for a while. That's the thing about a story like Soul Blazer. Once you've seen the morning break over a world you helped mend, the dark don't seem quite so heavy anymore. I'm glad you sat with me tonight. If this journey through the silence did something for your spirit, go on and hit that like button, subscribe to the Hearth here, and ring that notification bell. It's the best way to make sure you're always welcome when the next fire is lit. Now I know some nights you ain't looking for a 90-minute epic. Sometimes the world out there just gets a bit too loud, and you need a place to clear your mind for a few minutes and just breathe. That's why we've started our side quest series. These are shorter, standalone tales meant for relaxation and meditation. Sometimes they're stories from games I didn't cover in the main quest, or maybe they're original pieces of fiction built from the cracks and corners of legends you thought you knew. Our first one, Oak and Iron, is already waiting for you. It's the tale of a machine named Robo in a forest that refused to die, straight from the heart of Chrono Trigger. And speaking of that world, I've got a new series starting this coming Sunday, based on my own writings. It's the story of Schala, Princess of Zeal, a soul lost in time looking for a way home. So whether you're here for the long haul or just a quick escape into the side quests, I'm honored to have you at my fire. Thank you for listening, for caring about the threads of these old tales, and for keeping the light burning right along with me. The night is still dark, but you've got the morning in your pocket now. Farewell for now, friends. Good night.